This is the debrief presented by Bright Hire. The debrief is a series of conversations with founders, executives, and talent thought leaders on how they've built high-performing diverse teams. I'm your host, Teddy Chestnut, Bright Hire co-founder, and today I am truly thrilled to welcome our guest. He's been at LinkedIn for nearly 15 years, has led sales, product, currently COO, and someone who, in a very full circle way, actually interviewed me for a job way back in the day. Dan Shapero. Dan, thank you so much for joining me today on the debrief.
Thank you. It's wonderful to be here. It's good to see you as well.
You too, man. Like I mentioned, we are here to learn from your experience building great teams, including the team at LinkedIn and before. But before I jump in, we like to start off like a little bit of rapid fire to get the juices flowing. Ready?
Let's do it.
On LinkedIn's team, what's LinkedIn's most underrated product feature?
Underrated product feature. I still think people aren't using video enough to share content. I think that, we've got a lot of great, text and images, but the people that I really respond to right now are the people that are putting video on the platform. And I think in particular, people's stories of things that they've done in their career and what they've learned from them. I just find it so interesting.
You've been doing a big video series on LinkedIn. When do you find the time to do that?
Little nuggets. It takes me about 20 minutes to shoot the video, run it through a caption editor and post it. But, oftentimes, at least when it's during the school year, I'll walk my kids to school because it's kind of right around the corner. And oftentimes I would shoot the videos on the walk home. So it's about a half a mile each way. So kind of on the walk home, I'll shoot the video.
Nice. Okay. Super salad.
Oh, soup or salad, not super salad. Got it.
Soup or salad.
I'll go salad. I just had a salad for lunch today. It was great.
What's the last recommendation that you gave? Like somebody asked you for a recommendation on something, you gave it. What was it?
I love traveling, and people invariably ask me for travel advice. And, I think I was recommending ski trips.
Okay. All right. What are you reading or listening to right now that you really like?
I just re-listened to Thinking Fast and Slow.
Ooh.
I don't know if you've read that book by Daniel Kahneman. It's super interesting and it's dense. And after you read it once, you kind of realize that you probably missed 90% of all of the nuggets. So I just re-listened to it. System
1, System 2. That's what I got.
That's right. That's a good one. Yeah. Yeah. There's sort of the fast thinking brain and the slow thinking brain. Yeah.
What's your favorite interview question and why?
What are you most proud of?
And why? Why?
Oh, well, I think that the question about what you're proud of is really a values question. You're not really asking them what's the best thing you did. It's sort of what about your job and your work do you find meaningful? And I think it really shines an interesting light into the person. And what I typically love to hear is a person that is proud of doing things that are hard, that are impactful, and where people are involved. And so, you might hear someone talk a lot about being proud of what they did. You'll hear a different style of leader talk about what the team did or how they helped someone overcome a big challenge. And then, normally that's followed up by going super deep on how they figured out whatever they figured out. And you tend to find that in addition to learning about their values as a professional, you get to really see how much depth they have on the topic. And, great interviews are ones where you can just keep going deeper and deeper and deeper into the why behind the what and the cause and effect relationships and what they did. And so I feel like with one question, and usually I'll ask them for 3 different things that they were proud of. So I sort of see a spectrum that you can spend 20 minutes on that question and you can learn so much about someone.
When did you start to ask that question? Like, have you been doing it for 20 years? You started doing it really early, or was there a moment when you realized, or somebody taught you that this was something that you could do and it was really valuable and predictive?
Yeah, I think that I sort of stumbled upon it. I don't remember exactly how it happened, but it's probably 8 to 10 years old. I think early in my career, I interviewed on content, just like, how do you solve problems? Like, can you do the job? But I really learned, and I think one of the things that makes LinkedIn special is that there's a real attention to the how we do our work and the kinds of leaders that we nurture, and the fact that they are both heart and mind. And so I started just thinking about how do I bring that to the surface in a way that's not obvious, where the person doesn't immediately jump to something. And I think this question of what are you proud of is just so basic, and yet it really shares a lot about the person.
Makes sense. We're going to talk about your leadership at LinkedIn and hiring and building teams there, but I actually was on your LinkedIn profile. I want to go way back. Your exposure to or involvement in recruiting dates like a decade before that, when you were CEO and founder of Collegiate Recruiting Technology.
Yes.
2 year stint on the LinkedIn profile. Tell me about that. What was it all about? What were you doing? What was the team? What was that part of the journey?
Yeah. So it was it's a funny history because, I was 19 and I got involved in college recruiting for basically it's sort of a website to help high school athletes interact with college coaches. And the fact that I'm out at LinkedIn is just like this funny evolution. But the story is as follows. I was a math major. I can specifically remember where I was when I looked at the chalkboard back when they used chalk, and realized that I'm not using any of this math ever, like ever. Like it was just so esoteric. We're talking about differential equations of bacteria growth or something. And I was a little bit deflated, and I went home for the summer, and I remember having a conversation with my dad, saying, maybe I'll drop out. I'm just not into it. I just don't think that this is interesting. I'm not learning. And he very smartly guided me essentially to a side hustle. He's like, finish your degree, but why don't you find something on the side to go do? And it was right around 98. It was when the internet was coming up. And I had been a high school soccer player. And one of the things about high school soccer is that there isn't a huge infrastructure around how scholarships or recruiting happens, like in some of the bigger sports like football or basketball. And it was really hard to figure out how to make connections with college coaches. And I sort of wondered, hey, is there a role for the internet to play in doing this? So me and this buddy, he was more technical and I was more product and business. We essentially built this platform for, believe it or not, high school athletes to build profiles, like a la LinkedIn, and then coaches to come in and search for them. And we built this cool business, and it really taught me that I love building and I love connecting people and helping people find opportunities by virtue of matchmaking is super interesting. And so we had a little bit of success. I sold it when we graduated, and it was a really cool experience.
Was it just you and a co-founder? Was there a team involved?
It was me and a co-founder, and then we hired 4 of our friends at like $15 an hour to do, some coding work and some. I sent one of my friends, shout out to Dan Wang if you're listening. I sent one of my friends with a list of flyers to go to a local soccer tournament and put flyers on all the cars and to market the product. I think he almost got arrested because you weren't, like, it was like soliciting, like in theory. So luckily he didn't, he's all fine. He's actually like a amazing friend. But it was me and my partner and then 4 of our friends.
Okay. So it's probably not like a real interview process involved in the hiring, or maybe I shouldn't make an assumptions. Maybe you could.
No, it was, do you have any time on Thursday? Because I could use some help.
Did that experience, I won't presume that you learned anything about hiring given the structure of the team in that experience, but did it teach you anything that like ultimately was foundational for work that you did later? I mean, the founder, CEO, there's usually people look back on that. There's something that they learned, some kernel that had an impact. I don't want to project it, but
yeah, I think like any career experience, it was a ton of firsts. So it was the first time that I cold called someone and tried to convince them to have a conversation with me. It was the first time where I had to give my friends some feedback that the job they had done wasn't what we needed, which was super hard. Is like some of my close friends, but learning to be clear about what we needed, and that might be different from what they were thinking. It was the first time where I learned about working with someone who is technical, and you've got a picture in your head of what you want to do, and they're trying to get it done. And you got to be out of their hair so that they can be effective, but you also want to influence the process and make sure that you're on the same page about what you're trying to accomplish together. So it's just a zillion firsts. First time I gave a speech at a conference, I went to a trade show and bought a booth and gave out clipboards. Oh, this is a funny story. Sorry. So we're going to go aside for a second. So we were going to the National Association of College Coaches Conference, and we got a booth, and there's like 1,000 coaches there. And my dad goes to me, how are you gonna get people to your booth? You should give something away. And I realized that I could buy clipboards and get our names on them. These are like these nice dry erase clipboards.
Every coach needs a clipboard.
What's that?
Every coach needs a clipboard.
Coaches use clipboards, right? It's got their name right there. It's perfect. And so how many are you going to get? And I was like, I don't know, 100. He's like, you should get ones for everyone at the conference. So I bought 1,000 clipboards. Okay. Now clipboards are not small nor lightweight. And so there was this whole phase of my life of getting rid of 1,000 clipboards, because obviously I didn't get rid of 1,000 at the conference, but I still have one to this day, and it works very well.
I can imagine like your kid's schedule is now on this clipboard. Speaking of first, okay, that experience, fast forward a decade, you joined LinkedIn. I think your title was like GM of the LinkedIn Research Network or something to that effect, which I don't believe exists today.
Correct.
Maybe didn't exist when you joined. Like, what was the story around joining LinkedIn?
Sure.
Your first couple days, first year, what was that all? How did you get in the door?
Sure. So there's a bit of a story here. So I was a consultant, and I had realized that I was sort of ready to go back to building companies, which I learned that I love so much. And LinkedIn was at this like really cool stage of being an early cool product, about 300 employees. And it was the number one on my list of about 5 companies that I wanted to go pursue. And it was the only company that I couldn't get someone to call me. I couldn't network my way in. I didn't know anyone that worked there. And so I found a job, and I went for the website, and there were no jobs that matched my background. And so I searched for any job that I could find that was like what I knew how to do. And I found an entry-level analyst job. And I was post MBA and post, consulting at a top firm. And I literally wrote a cover letter that I was like, this isn't the right job for me. Will someone please call me? And lo and behold, the person that called me back was Mike Gampson, who became my manager for almost a decade and was really the early architect of building out the sales team at LinkedIn. And the stage that we were at was we had just developed this platform, LinkedIn, where people would create profiles and connections, but we really didn't know what businesses we could build on top of it. There was an early sign that maybe recruiting was interesting. There was some advertising, but we really didn't know. I think it was about $80 million in total revenue a year relative to today, much, much bigger. Right. So Mike had an idea that you could go on LinkedIn and search for experts to do calls with, to learn about topics. And we were thinking maybe we'd do that, and maybe we would do surveys. And so my first job was literally going into LinkedIn and finding people that could answer questions on topics and sending them messages to have conversations with customers. And I did that all day long. Like I'd sort of program these queries, and then I'd send people messages. It was kind of like recruiting for projects.
Do you remember what your interview process was like to join?
Oh, I think I interviewed with 6 or 7 folks, everything from product to sales to the executive on the team was a woman named Sarah Imbach, the CEO of the company. Yeah, it was a pretty intense process.
It's unusual to join a company and have the same manager for 10 years. Actually, that's kind of a remarkable story. And I'm sure you learned a ton from Mike along the way, but I'm curious what you learned from him about hiring in particular. That's a skill, right? Building a team, selecting who to have join. What were your conversations with him like over the course of a decade about assessment, selection, hiring, team building? What were the themes like?
Sure. Well, I think that I learned, first of all, I learned a ton from Mike. And, one of the great gifts in my career is working for someone that I always aspired to be more like in many ways. Like I saw how he was a professional, and it was very obvious to me that if I could learn to be a little bit more like that in a bunch of different directions, and obviously like I have different skills that are my own and core to me, but there was just so much I had to learn from him and be able to follow him for and it was quite a decade, but at least 6 or 7 years was pretty amazing. But the thing that I learned from him is he always had this really beautiful balance in his mind between performance and potential. He was always really trying to understand how someone could contribute now, but in many ways would take very big bets on people that he knew would grow into superstars over time. And I think one of the real smart moves that we made at LinkedIn is, particularly in the middle management layer, kind of senior IC layer and the lower level of management, we just made huge bets on folks with tons of capability. And those people have gone on to play huge roles at the company. So many of them are here, more than a decade later, running businesses. So I think that was a big thing. The other thing that I learned from him was that we're hiring for a wonderful mix of head and heart. And too much one way, and you're not gonna sort of deliver in the way that we want as a company and the culture we want to build, but this wonderful balance, and you really can't sacrifice one for the other, I think was a big part of learning how to hire well. And probably maybe the other thing that he really instilled in me is the best way to understand how someone's going to do in their job is to give them a real life problem that they might actually enact on the job. So if you're interviewing a salesperson, how do you actually replicate a sales call? If you're giving someone an analytical job, how do you give them an analytical problem?
Yep.
I learned a lot from Mike.
You mentioned that you joined LinkedIn at 300 people. It's now
20,000 approximately.
20,000. Okay, so
give or take.
So you've gone through a few phases of growth. How has your view on hiring changed, if at all, across I don't know how you define the phase, 100 to 1,000, 1,000 to 10,000, 10,000 to 20,000. Maybe you think about it in different cohorts. Actually, be interesting to hear actually what cohorts you think about require a different approach and how your thinking has changed.
Yeah, I'm not sure that I have a view of hiring that changes with the scale of the company. I mean, obviously, the technology you need to run an effective team.
The operation changes.
The operation changes in a zillion ways. But sort of how do you think about the things that need to go through your mind when you're making hires? I think that early on, all we hired was externally, because we needed to grow the team. And as we got bigger, really understanding how to balance searching externally while also nurturing people internally and preparing them for jobs was a very big deal. And I think that at certain phases in our growth, we skewed one way or the other. But I think that just being really conscious, that balance has been really important. I think the other thing that I've learned is that, and this is a big part of the discipline that you're bringing to the space, is that there's a huge way in which the interviewer influences how well people perform. And also that there's a lot of people that I've probably interviewed where they were capable, I just couldn't see it, right? And so a good thing that I learned about myself, and I think this is pretty common, is that the more someone's background looks like yours, the more their life experience is similar to yours, the faster that you are likely to see their potential, okay? And similarly, there's a group of people that perform really well on the spot, and there's a group of people that need prep. And so I've learned to do two things. One is that I tend to, if I'm going to ask them a hard analytical problem, I try to give them some forewarning so that they can think it through a little bit, because people have different degrees of doing their best problem solving in the moment versus with prep. And then similarly, I think that I used to think in my mind that the faster I come to a conclusion on this person's good, that means they're more likely to be good. And I actually remember interviewing you, Teddy, when you joined LinkedIn, and I knew you were going to be awesome in 7 minutes. I remember looking at the clock and I was like, I'm done. This is going to be great. So, but that has,
you were wrong.
I don't think you were, you did a great job. You're awesome. But what I realized is that had as much to do with your capability as it did with how familiar I was with the kind of background you had. And so if you had taken someone else from a completely different experience, educational experience, life experience, it might have taken me 20 minutes to see their potential or longer. And the key is that the fact that it took me longer actually has more to do with my relationship with them than it does with how good they are. And so I've learned to delay my judgment on candidates well into the interview. And I think that's been very, very helpful.
How do you scale that? 300 people, now you're 20,000 people. You probably have, I don't know, 10,000 people across LinkedIn involved in interviewing in some regard. How do you take that moment that's really changed the way that you think about how you run an interview and how you come to a conclusion about a candidate and get that in the hands of 10,000 people?
Yeah, I mean, there's a whole number of, I think what you're kind of asking in general is like, how do you scale management or how do you scale best practice?
Yeah, I guess, yeah. I mean, this is just one aspect.
This is a version of that, right?
Exactly.
And there's a bunch of different things, you know, and they apply differently in different situations. I mean, I think there's very much true that you manage what you measure. And so if something's important to you, then making sure that you have ways to know whether it's happening and then you can track your performance against it is a big deal. I think obviously systematizing things or building process into technology is a really helpful way to scale best practice. But I'm also a big believer that people tend to follow truth. Like if you have something to offer people as advice and it's good and it makes sense to them, they will take it. And so I spend a lot of my time in my job just teaching what I think best practice looks like. And what I found is that if I do that consistently and I pick my things that I want to focus on, people pick it up, right? Like, and this idea of delaying judgment into the interview process is a very simple thing that you can do if you're made aware that that's probably some of the inherent biases that you have as a human being, right? Like, actually, it's funny, Daniel Kahneman that we talked about, the book I've read, part of the book, what he talks about is that the faster that you have something as familiar, the more you think you like it. Same thing's true with candidates.
We ran, apropos of this, we ran an analysis of like 150,000 interviews or so and looked at a couple things, but one thing we looked for was just the prevalence of whether sports came up in the conversation. And it turned out that when it did, those candidates were twice as likely to get hired.
Huh. Did that apply to other like common ground?
We only looked at two, sports and family.
Huh.
And both, it turned out, had a positive impact. Interestingly, on the sports one, it had an even bigger impact when candidates were women.
Got it.
Familiar. I've got familiar ground.
Yeah.
I'm coming to the conclusion quickly, or at least that's how, there's more work to do to understand exactly what's going on, but that's an easy way to interpret or a natural way to interpret that finding.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, maybe to sort of build on that point, I think that when people are interviewing, the question that they are asking themselves in the back of their head is this, like on repeat, this question: are they good enough? Are they good enough? Are they good enough? Like they're just continuing to try to get a signal on whether that person crosses some threshold because they're afraid of the risk of making a bad hire. Like it's a big deal to make a bad hire. And so they're essentially in this massive risk mitigation process. Okay. And the way that people often mitigate risk in their life is through familiarity. Like, it's like, oh, you're familiar, you're less risky, right? And so we confuse familiarity with effectiveness. And so like, yeah, how do you unwind that human, natural behavior?
We've been talking about a narrow part of this, but there's a broader discussion around like the personal journey that you've been on, or personal and professional journey you've been on with respect to diversity hiring, allyship, and how you think about being inclusive in this moment in, your professional work and people's professional careers. It has like a huge impact. Like, what's that journey look like for you with respect to hiring, interviewing, recruiting, working with the TA team, sourcing, kind of that scope of work?
Oh yeah, it's been a massive journey, and I am incredibly proud of the community that we've built in LinkedIn from a diversity perspective, from an inclusive environment perspective. Whether you're talking about gender, whether you're talking about race, whether you're talking about, internationally, there's just so many aspects of it. And I think we've done a really amazing job. And, obviously more to do, but like really have come a long way. And, if anyone wants to go look up some of the sort of reporting that LinkedIn's done on our progress, I would encourage you to. But I think that there are a few things. I think one thing is that recognizing your own bias. And this one example that I've given of how to delay your judgment in an interview, to me, is a personal tactic I've used to impact my own inherent unconscious bias that I might be carrying. Similarly, I'm an extrovert. I solve problems on the spot. Some people are introverts or think in different ways. They're better at structuring their thoughts before and then they come in. And I've learned that whether or not you can solve a problem on the spot is not an indication of whether you're good at thinking through problems. And so that to me is a more cognitive diversity learning that I've had about my own process. We do a ton around diverse slates and looking at talent pools, and whether or not just the candidate pool is diverse, but whether the interview slate is diverse is also something we spend a lot of time thinking about. But I would say that one of the things that in particular is just a really big deal is whether or not as an organization you're willing to take bets on people that don't have exactly the background you're looking for. Because there's this whole narrative in the world about being talent pool limited, and there's some truth to the fact that talent pools have different demographics. But we have found that we can hire outside of our natural talent pool if we adjust the onboarding process to represent the fact that there might be some other things to learn. So early on, when we tried to hire from non-traditional talent pools for roles. So let's give an example. We're trying to hire teachers to join LinkedIn as sales professionals because they're good at explaining and communicating, but maybe don't have direct sales skills. If you onboard them like you onboard every other salesperson, it's hard. Like there's some core gaps. If you give them some specific training, in addition to what you're training them on your products around how to learn some basic sales skills, they're brilliant. And so there's this real important marrying of the talent pool you're looking at and the onboarding process to get to that end state. But I believe that end state's absolutely there.
It sounds like one of the things that you obviously have to do very differently was thinking about their onboarding, right? What do you teach them? What expectations do you set? How long do you get them to ramp? Were there certain specific things that you actually had to think about in the assessment process, the interview process, questions you're asking, the kinds of answers that you were looking for that differed from what sales managers would have been asking previously? Like, how did you actually change what you talked about in an interview to get to some truth that this person had the potential to be good in the role?
Yeah, I mean, to your point, you're obviously making a bigger bet on potential, and you're looking for, I would say, related skills, not exact skills. So I might not be able to walk you through a sales call and expect the same kind of, knowing how to handle a meeting like that, but I can ask you to debate or discuss a complicated topic and how clearly you communicate. I can talk about how would you convince me of an argument you really believe in? What kind of questions would you ask me? And you can see whether instincts are there. And I think you just have to slightly adapt your expectations, but you're still looking for the sort of the core material of aptitude. Now, the other thing I would say is that probably where we got it wrong the most early on was that the people coming from different backgrounds didn't actually understand the jobs they were applying to. So then they would show up and their expectations of what the jobs really were different than their understanding. And so the early group, we actually lost a bunch of people who went back to their old industry because they're like, actually, that thing isn't really what I thought it was. And so we had to do just as much educating of them on roles as we were hoping they would educate us about their capabilities.
Also in the interview, like, are we
in the interview process?
Are we explaining the role effectively? Are we describing, giving a real preview of what it's all about?
Yeah, what's a day in the life like? How does this job actually work?
Back to like scaling management best practices. You take a sales manager who has one open role on her team. She has a quota to hit. Now she's down a person. How did you collectively convince people in that position, feeling that kind of pressure, to take bets on potential versus try to pull the trigger on somebody who has done it before, held the quota, has more of the, I can hit the ground running sort of background?
Of course. Yeah. I mean, there's a number of different tactics, and I think it's pretty situational. I mean, one is just you reward managers who make bets on people and they turn out to be amazing. And so when you're talking about, if you're talking about sales managers, like oftentimes they're on quota, but they're also, who's going to get promoted. It's not always the person that has the highest attainment. What are the other factors that you're considering? And one of the things that we really factored in was talent development and diversity and nurturing folks and proving their ability to grow talent in addition to hire talent. So I think that your promotion criteria is a big factor. I also think that you can centralize a hiring process where you say, we are going to centrally hire 20 people from an alternative background, and we're going to invest in them ahead of then placing them on a team. So you can kind of bring some of that education before they hit the manager's team, as opposed to that the manager is taking on the burden. And then there's other things you can do more directly, like you could consider giving adjustments to goals based on, if you're thinking about diversity specifically during the ramp period, because maybe the ramp takes longer. So I think there's a bunch of things people can play with, but these are solvable problems.
I want to go back to like how things changed in the evolution of 300 to 20,000, and go specifically around the partnership that you had with the recruiting team, the talent acquisition team. Like, what did it look like in the beginning? How did it grow over time? And like, what are some of the most valuable things that you've received in that partnership as you've matured, grown, evolved the way that you think about hiring?
Yeah, I think the word partnership is key. And we are so fortunate to have, I'm going to argue, the best recruiting team in the world at LinkedIn. Amazing tools, amazing leaders, a real understanding of recruiting from a full funnel perspective. The big insight into LinkedIn's early recruiting business was that the future of recruiting looks a lot like sales and marketing. It's more proactive. It's more about offering a product to a candidate as opposed to them interviewing and coming in, and it's all about assessing them like they're assessing us too. So I think that we had a team that really understood all of that. I would say early on, we basically told our managers that the hiring is on them. They're not waiting for recruiting to show up. They are going to go find people. As we got bigger, I think we needed to learn to release some of that responsibility and partner more effectively with the recruiting team. And I think there's a healthy tension there, because the world's best recruiting teams, you need to give them the space to do their jobs and be great at it. But then similarly, you want hiring managers super involved in both sourcing and assessment. And so I actually like it when there's this really good give and take that occurs between a business unit and a talent team.
Is there anything that your TA partners have taught you or use data to inform you about that's been like a real light bulb?
Oh, I think some of these hypotheses around talent pools and how do we build a stronger pipeline of diverse candidates, and how do we set up the right onboarding, and how do we adjust the way that we do things? I think that has been led in a beautiful way by our TA team, and I've learned a ton.
Going way back to the beginning of the conversation and discussion about side hustles, on your LinkedIn profile, you're also like an angel investor in a handful of startups, like Edlift, Wealthfront, Susu, Brightheart customer, actually. I was super excited about.
Shout out to Samir.
Yeah, amazing. And now Larry, who's over there as well. I guess the question I have is how you think about investment selection as relates to talent selection. Like, what does that process look like for you? What about the teams that you invest in gets you really excited? What does like the interview process look like when you're thinking about angel investments?
Sure. Well, for me, there's really like three things that I pay attention to. There's people, there's purpose, and there's product. So maybe it's 3 Ps. I don't know. There you go. So I think with most of the angel investments, I either have known the people through working with them, or I've been introduced to them by people I know. And, I acknowledge that there's a bit of a, does that mean that money is more likely to go to people that have sort of networks associated with places like LinkedIn. And so I really try to make sure that I'm in the flow of conversations that are on topics I care about. So if you actually look at the common thread between a lot of the investments that my wife and I have made, Edulift, that's about helping minority and underrepresented groups succeed in graduate programs to get their first job, right? If you talk about a company like Springboard, that's a company that's helping people make career transitions by learning new technical skills with mentors. If you look at a company like Asusu, that's a company that is bringing more financial credit worthiness to underrepresented communities by virtue of the fact that they pay rent on time. So there's always, like, I try to find where possible, like, a social element to back up my beliefs with, my treasure.
Yeah. What do you give advice to these teams around team building, hiring? Like, how involved are you?
As much as they want to listen. It tends to be, it's very stressful to be a CEO of a startup company hiring a leadership team. I mean, you're entrusting so much of the future in a company in these leaders, and to some extent, you're sharing with them the burden of your vision, and it's a huge thing to get comfortable with. So I think that a lot of founders spend an enormous amount of time, and maybe you felt this, just really agonizing over their senior leadership hires. And when do you make the leap to bring someone on the journey with you? It's a huge deal.
Yeah. What kind of advice do you give other than asking them what they're most proud of?
Well, I think that founders often haven't done it before. And so they don't always know what they want before they're in the interview process. They almost use the interview process to figure out what they want or what they need. And so most of my questions are about saying, well, there's a candidate that's really good at this, and there's a candidate that's really good at that. And, like, have you really thought through which of those is more important to you? And I think sometimes they've started with a long list of criteria. I mean, this is like every recruiter's conversation with every hiring manager, right? Like, here's the 30 things that this person needs to be world-class at. And I think the same is true of founders, and whether or not they're really crisp on their priorities.
Yeah. Have you found you've done hiring in sales and product, COO, you've done executive level hiring. Is it fundamentally different in any ways, depending on that functional area of focus or the level of seniority? Like, have you found really important differences in what it means to hire for one versus the other? You've already talked about some similarities, right? Like, give people the time to prepare, delay judgment, let them show their work. But have you found differences in functional areas? Yeah,
well, I think the more senior, I mean, like, when you're hiring someone that's more junior, you're to a lot extent, you're hiring them to play a role. And you have a sense of what that role is, and you have a sense of the variety of different playbooks that tend to be successful in that role. And really what you're asking yourself is, can this person successfully do this role? With an executive, typically you're doing two things. There's probably one big challenge that the organization is facing that this person's going to go need to figure out. And so you're trying to see, do I really believe this person can do this very specific and hard thing? Whether they've done it before or they've done things that lead you to believe that they can. And then at the same time, whatever's coming next, you don't know. Like, what the problem space is for the executive is it's always evolving. And so you're betting on some level on like, can you do this really hard thing? And can you do anything that might come? And so I tend to try to live in both of those worlds and understand their understanding of the specific issue and also their broad problem solving capability. And then back to this idea of head and heart, how do they think about people? Could you ask them to, actually, one of the things I do more senior is I ask them to teach me something. I want to see if they can take something that's hard to understand and communicate it, because the bigger the team they have, the more that's going to be a critical part of being effective. You don't, as a leader, get the chance to explain yourself that often. You have to sort of hit it hard and hit it clearly at the first go. And so I think some people have really a honed skill of that.
When you make hires, I'm presuming that those candidates speak with multiple people on your team. What do you look for in the feedback that you get from your teammates who have spoken with that candidate? What makes for helpful feedback? Do you coach them on what you're looking for? Like, this is a collaborative effort, hiring is a team sport. What do you expect of the rest of your team when it comes to running an effective interview process and ultimately empowering you to make a call?
Yeah, I mean, it's really about divvying up the set of questions you have about the candidate and making sure everyone understands what role that they're playing. And I do think that it's also helpful to have some overlapping. So I found that if I'm sort of assessing problem solving skills, it's really actually helpful for someone else to make sure they also have a chance to push them so that they can push me on my conclusion. And there's almost like a second guessing that can happen, particularly in senior roles. So I think divvying up roles is really important. I also think, every interview is a chance to learn more about what the person's interested in. And so, and I feel like sometimes candidates share different things with different people. And so bringing that story together to get a more holistic view of like, why are they really interested in this role? And does that make sense for us? I think is really useful.
Do you have any rubric or rule of thumb on ultimately whether you make a call yes or no on somebody? You speak to a panel, two yeses and a no, is it consensus or is it really a case-by-case basis?
Oh, I mean, I think that there's, my personal view is the hiring manager makes the call. Like, I don't believe in consensus hiring. I believe that everyone should listen. The hiring manager should listen to everyone. And I think it's really important to make sure that cross-functional partners play a role in hiring, because if this person's going to not just be on your team, but interacting with other members of the company, you want to make sure that they have a role in the process. And then I think there's like a real opportunity for someone to have a hard no. And so, if someone's like, I'm just not there, like, I think this is a bad call. I think you as a hiring manager owe it to that person to take another look and almost like become curious about their feedback and really make sure you're comfortable with like what the decision you're making is. So I sort of almost believe in a hiring manager's decision, but that if someone's really concerned, that hiring manager believes that there is truth in that feedback somewhere, and they need to go kind of figure it out.
Makes sense. You get to the end of the process, everybody's yes, you want to close a candidate. Have you ever gone like above and beyond to get somebody across the line?
What's above and beyond?
I don't know, other than send them an offer and wait till they accept it. Like, Nick Mano was on this a while ago. He's CEO of Gainsight.
I saw him on Monday.
Oh yeah. So there was a version of like he realized that like one of the candidates liked a certain rap song, and he like created like a whole like ad-libbed version of that song about how he wanted to close him, and he sent it to him, and he like filmed it in like a broom closet. Just like, I'm gonna find some way. College recruiting. I'm gonna go like, I know you're not the only decision maker. I'm gonna go talk to your wife and your mom and and your neighbor, and like, have you ever had to go through that where like there was just somebody who you needed to get across the line and you pulled out all the stops?
No, I haven't. In that way.
LinkedIn's got too strong of a brand.
For me, well, and maybe that's part of it. I mean, maybe that's part of it. I am really a believer that at some point, working too hard is likely to yield people that needed to be convinced more than maybe they should have needed to be convinced. And I actually think the same is true of customers. Like there is some truth in that if you need to work too hard to convince a customer, there's probably some truth in the fact that it was a questionable call on their side. And so I think that the key is just to slow down and just to create space and to have a long conversation about what they're thinking and what you're thinking. And to me, maybe going above and beyond is to creating ample space to probably have 3 or 4 conversations about how they're thinking about it. And, I think the thing that maybe hiring managers miss is they sort of don't really spend a lot of time connecting with the candidate between the interview and the offer.
Mm.
Like, and that's the time when you should be checking in constantly. How do you feel about that interview? What would you think? Would you learn? Because you're trying to learn about that person and you're trying to understand and build a relationship, so that when you get to the moment where you're trying to be convincing,
Mm-hmm.
you're being convincing from a place of a relationship, not from a place of transactional, converting someone to become an employee.
Mm-hmm. If you had all of your interviews across LinkedIn analyzable in the same way that you have like your sales calls analyzable, what would you want to learn? Or what questions would you want to ask?
I think that I think you can create good structures to assess very specific skills. And so I think that you can standardize the questions. I think you can build rubrics to analyze the results. But I just think the interviewers see potential in people very much based on their life experience. Because essentially you're saying, like, what are the markers of future success? And like, yours, and maybe those of the people around you, but there's probably a lot of people you really are kind of different experiences, work experiences, home experiences that are different. So I'd be curious to what extent, like, managers, like we can assess managers separately on their ability to assess performance and their ability to assess potential.
All right, last question. What are you most proud of?
Well, first of all, I'm proud of you. Like, amazing job. I mean, it's cool. Like, I remember interviewing you right out of business school, and you come to LinkedIn, and like your trajectory and like everything that, seeing you develop as a leader and then going off and doing something meaningful with that learning, I think is very meaningful to me. And I think I feel that at large, there are so many amazing people that have grown and transformed their careers at LinkedIn. Many of them are crushing it at LinkedIn after long periods of time. And some of them have gone on to do amazing things outside of LinkedIn. Some of them go outside of LinkedIn and then they come back to LinkedIn. And so I'm just proud of the team that we've built, the special sauce of LinkedIn's culture and what people have accomplished. But actually, I think the thing I'm most proud of is that I think people's lives are better because of LinkedIn. I think that 10 or 20 years ago, talent was invisible outside of the walls of your company. Like, you as a professional didn't have offers coming your way. You didn't have recruiters contacting you because they couldn't find you. And it was really hard to be seen. And I think that created a very unhealthy relationship in many companies between employers and employees, where employers had the leverage. And I think that the thing that we have done is we have increased the balance of influence that employers and employees have in that relationship. And I think it has led to people being much, much, much happier in their work life. And that's like millions and millions of people around the world. So I think I am going to like look back on my time at LinkedIn at some point and say, we put a dent in the universe. People are happier at work because their relationship with their employer is a healthy thing. And I think that's pretty cool.
That's pretty cool. Dan, thank you for joining us.
It was a pleasure.
Really fun. For those listening, you can catch all the other episodes of the debrief at brighthire.ai. Good luck interviewing, building teams, happy hiring. And Dan, thanks again. This was super fun.
Take care, everyone.